Okay. Hello, and welcome everyone to our webinar, Meeting the Moment, New Data on Learning Loss and What We Can Do About It. Today's event is organized by the Population Council's Evidence for Gender and Education Resource Program, or EGER, as it's better known. I am Nicole Haberland, Senior Associate at the Population Council, and we thank you for taking the time to join us today. We know everyone is webinared out, but this one is worth it. So in today's discussion, we'll examine some of the first field-based studies documenting learning loss due to COVID-19 school closures and the inequities that lie below the surface of these findings. Following this peek at the data, we'll reflect on what the data mean for students and teachers as schools begin to reopen, and look at one example of an evidence-based approach that can address this learning loss. Finally, we'll learn about the long-term implications if we do nothing, and the potential for long-term benefits if we do. With that, I'm delighted to introduce our panelists today. Paul Atherton, economist and founder of Fab Inc., a provider of knowledge and analytical tools to help improve learning for all children. Sajida Amin, senior associate at the Population Council, who has done some of the council's most seminal research on child marriage and on girls' empowerment. Rukmini Banerjee, CEO of Pratham, one of the largest and most successful non-governmental education organizations in India. And Michelle Kaffenberger, research fellow at RISE and University of Oxford. Michelle leads research analyzing education systems, learning outcomes, and ways to address the learning crisis. So with that, welcome everyone. I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and I would like to give the floor to Paul, who is going to share initial findings from studies in Kenya and Nepal.
Well, thank you so much. Let me just get up. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to talk today about some estimates of learning losses from studies in Kenya and Nepal. These estimates are based around the Girls' Education Challenge. So it's not an evaluation of the Girls' Education Challenge, which was a FCDO funded initiative, but rather we basically worked with two of the project partners to go back to the secondary schools they'd been working in and supporting in to try and basically remeasure learning to get estimates of learning levels a couple of years after. Just to actually, I'll just carry on. I can see some side of my screen, which is quite annoying, but hopefully you'll be able to see the main things. So yeah, we basically went back and measured learning outcomes in the same secondary schools where the two GC projects have been working. So we partnered with EDT in Kenya and Mercy Court in Nepal, and we explicitly measured the girls' learning levels to try and see how much it had changed during school closures, and then we did some qualitative research to try and understand the experience of school closures. I'm just going to go very quickly because time is quite short, but there's a full research paper which will be published very soon. So as I said before, we spoke with girls in the same grade, in the same term, pre and post COVID. So they were previously tested in July 2019. There's some details that are on the kind of sample sizes. The key point here to take away is we essentially have two sets of estimates. One is from across cohorts and the other is from a group of panel girls. What this means in practice is we can compare the average learning levels in schools before COVID hit and after the school closures. And then for a subset of girls in Nepal, we're quite lucky where we can track the same girls. So it's a smaller sample, but the same girls over time, which gives us estimates of how much they've literally remembered or forgotten over the time period. I'll just start off very quickly in Kenya. As they say, the samples were relatively balanced before and after. The key thing here is these are girls who were in Form 1 and Form 2 of secondary school who are about 16 years old. So we'd expect relatively advanced mathematical knowledge. And what we found is actually we found quite substantial learning losses over time. So the blue lines here are for reading, and we found reading declined quite substantially from girls getting about 60 percentage points correct down to about 44 percentage points correct. So we saw quite steep, substantial learning losses in terms of reading, and smaller losses in math, still statistically significant from a lower base. And we can compare these to Standard deviation changes are in the range of 0.4 to 0.6 in Kenya, and we can look at the equivalent years of schooling. But one thing to flag is we found very substantial learning losses, but we found these not to be uniform, interestingly, and we found that, you know, when we looked across the country, and here's some visual maps, the green dots are actually schools where the average learning was better after COVID. So I think the key thing for us to take away here is we have inequalities in terms of the learning losses across the country, and we tried to dig into this a bit more. But it also shows that kind of learning losses were not predestined. So there is things we can do, and we can discuss that a bit more later. Just to give you a sense of what this means, and to go back, these are secondary girls aged 16. Some simple questions around, you know, multiplication. How many litres of milk did they drink? The percentage getting it right fell from 26% to 16%. We've got a few other examples of these in the paper as well. And I think the key point here is that even simple tasks for girls at quite advanced levels of schooling, we saw quite substantial learning losses. Going across to Nepal, the situation was again similar. The sample was relatively balanced, so some interesting changes in the language spoken at home here, and we did boost the sample a little bit. But again, we're looking at the average for the cross cohort panel. And we also managed to find some of the same girls who were 15 years old on average when they were last tested, and we tested them when they were 17. So quite getting quite old for secondary school girls. Again, we found quite substantial learning losses, admittedly here from a lower level, and we can talk in the Q&A around some of the testing points. Again, we found higher performance in reading than maths, but here we found very similar learning levels, or drops in terms of the two subjects. For the girls where we had the panel data, so this is literally the same girl that was tested in July in 2019, we again saw very similar levels of learning losses, which again is not the kind of the change on average, but this is girls forgetting things they knew before. So we saw that for reading, they had a 14 percentage points learning loss, and we saw an even greater decline actually in mathematics ability. So this is girls who, because of school closures, even though they've still remained enrolled in schools and came back after the pandemic, we saw that they've forgotten some key things. I think this leads into the discussion we'll have on teaching at the right level, because we need to understand what girls are now. Again, we saw that losses were not the same across countries, and we saw that some schools were even doing better. So we found very obvious inequalities around the area. Here, interestingly, in Nepal, we found that the girls maintained the levels across the easier tasks, but the achieved levels remain quite low. So simple multiplication here, we found that very roughly similar shares got that correct. And we've not really dug into it, but it does seem that stuff which was useful in terms of the outside world did maintain. So a lot of girls reported working in family businesses, so some of these calculations are quite useful as well in day-to-day life. What we found is other things like fractions. So comparing fractions into a percentage, we saw quite a stark drop. So this is just changing 3/5 into a percentage, drop from 37%, 38% in July 2019 to just 12% afterwards. So some of these kind of more advanced operations seem to be suffering falls. Moving quite swiftly on, I said we did some qualitative research as well. I just want to highlight this here. We found that very few girls studied regularly. We'll come into this in a moment, but the main modality was radio and cell phones, and we found girls were often out of coverage. And there was a lot of concerns raised by the girls about a lack of support, because support was often one way, they couldn't ask questions. We don't have time to go into it, but I think there's a lot of stuff on mental health here. So we've talked about learning losses, but wider impacts of COVID, I don't think we should underestimate. Uncertainty around reopening meant that they found it hard to engage and continue as the pandemic dragged on. In Nepal, we found post-grade 10 dropouts and a lot of early marriages driving dropouts. And in Kenya, girls flagged issues around pregnancy and transactional sex as well. So I don't think we should underestimate the non-learning impacts of COVID as well. And I'll just skip very quickly through this, and I think this is a discussion for the wider community, but distance learning was done primarily through cell phones and radio. When we mapped where girls are in coverage, we found a lot of them were outside the coverage range, which meant that it was very difficult for them to access. And we found this when we asked girls how often did they engage. So only a very small share of girls actually engaged with the radio lessons daily. The majority didn't listen that often, and the same in Kenya. So just in terms of takeaways, we found the learning losses are real. Some schools very noticeable. As I say, there's a lot of inequalities in the losses. Some were gained, which shows that these were not predestined. And it's not just a failure for children to learn new things, but children forgot what they previously knew. I think we'll talk in more detail, but we can restart assuming that the girls are at the levels they were before because of the learning losses highlighted. I think there's a discussion to be had on how we reach girls, because when it is radio and distance learning, if we know coverage is limited and one-way lecturing limits learning, how do we as an education community try to think through and plan better for the challenge of learning without the school? So how do we support and engage communities? Let me stop there because I realise I'm 30 seconds over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, so much for sharing this very troubling data and your excellent insights. I feel like we've all been doing our best to anticipate the impact of school closures and with projections and proactive interventions, but it's been a bit of guesswork. Now as the data start to come in, it is not looking good. And as Paul alluded to, it may be particularly not good for girls. While all children will suffer learning setbacks during school closures, getting back into school when they reopen and then staying there may be particularly hard for girls due to pressures to marry or pregnancy, for example, like Paul suggested. And boys may also face barriers such as pressure to work. Girls face these same challenges, plus additional girl-specific barriers. All right, we're collecting questions and we'll have a Q&A at the end. But next, we're going to hear from Sajida, who will share her findings from Bangladesh.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to share some findings also from an intervention research study but in rural Bangladesh. And the objective of this study was to offer remedial education to girls who are at high risk of dropout for marriage. And this is in partnership with local schools under the Ministry of Education with funding from UNICEF. Next slide, please. So I'll give you a little overview of the COVID context, some details about the studies, and then the data, the evidence, and then some peeks into the programmatic strategies that we use. Next slide, please. The first COVID case was detected in Bangladesh in March 2020. By October 21, there were 1.5 million confirmed cases, 27,000 COVID deaths. These are considered underestimates, but the important thing to note is throughout most of the pandemic, up until the third wave, the cases were concentrated in Dhaka. But lockdown was severe initially and prolonged in this case of schooling. So Bangladesh had the longest duration of school closures. Next slide, please. Schools were closed between March 2020 and September 2021. The government offered online and television-based curriculum lessons and encourage local teachers to go on social media and reach their students that way. In January 2021, schools offered auto promotion. So all students were considered to be in the next grade. Where we did these rapid surveys, we found that girls were very nervous. 68% were very opposed to auto-promotion because they already didn't know the material and they had a different set of materials that they were now going to not know. Over the period during COVID, during the 3 rapid surveys, we saw that engagement with schooling actually got worse, both in terms of percents reporting they didn't study at all and percent not following the government digital classes on TV. About a third of the respondents said that they were no longer following. Next slide, please. In terms of why they were not following, the reasons varied quite a bit, ranging from not having a smartphone, which would be one way of engaging on social media, which is what the first girl said, to not having the routine, not having the schedule they were meant to follow, and then also kind of very limited duration of lessons. And finally, even the third quote, the girl, this respondent says that even though she had internet access, she was not allowed to have Facebook because her family was conservative and therefore never got any exposure to all of the remote education that was happening. So this is not surprising, but it gives you a bit of the texture of what this experience with remote learning was. Moving now to the correlates of learning loss. So our levels of loss and our strategy for assessing loss was quite similar, but I'll walk you through the methods that we followed. So our sample is a representative sample of in-school girls in the control villages of our study. We didn't do this assessment. We did the assessment in both control and intervention, but I'm only showing the results for the control just to see what was happening in general. The sample size was around 2,400 girls. The dependent variable was a 23-point score, which included Bangla and English assessments, very simple sentences, as well as math and some analytical questions. The median score at baseline was 16, and in this repeat cross-section survey, so on average in the baseline, girls were able to respond to more questions than at endline. So aggregate level of learning loss. Our estimation techniques in terms of estimating the level of loss between baseline and endline was in bivariate and multivariate regressions, and we're really focusing here and in our analysis on the variations in loss. And we're particularly interested in wealth differences, as well as assessing levels of learning associated with ownership of TV, smartphone, as well as marital status, which is one way in which girls completely disengage when they get married. Next slide, please. In this 23-point score, just to give you a sense for the dimensions of this score, there's about a 1-point increase for every grade attained in this sample in that score. So, and the overall level of loss is between 2018 and 2021 was 1 point, so equivalent to 1 grade of learning. The bottom 40% in terms of wealth ranking already had lower scores in 2018. And our estimate of loss among the poor is 3 times greater than the estimate for the not poor. And finally, TV or smartphone ownership did not mitigate learning loss during COVID at all. Next slide, please. So these are the estimates. I would please like you to focus on the third set of blue and yellow, which is the only result that's significant in terms of learning loss. Higher bars indicate greater loss. And here you see that the poorest quintile had a loss 3 times greater, as I said, than the non-poor. There are differences by television ownership, smartphone ownership, and marital status, but these differences in terms of the loss are not statistically significant for these other indicators. Next slide, please. Let me just say a little bit about what we did to mitigate these changes in anticipation of learning loss. We implemented, we had an in-person program, had done a year of it. We implemented socially distanced learning and essentially using mentors in the community and distributing hard copies of learning material. The mentors engaged students in 15-minute WhatsApp sessions twice a week and in small groups and encourage social interaction. And our early results suggest that there was less loss in learning in the intervention areas relative to control, particularly in math and analytical scores. And there was an increase in child marriage by about 18% in the control villages, but not in the intervention villages. So I'm going to wrap up by just talking about some of the takeaways. Next slide, please. Which is that what we're seeing is not only is the level of learning loss something to think about, but there's considerable variation. And the one thing that we need to focus on is how to reach the most disadvantaged, the poorest, who are already disadvantaged in other ways and have been more so during COVID. And finally, the strategies we've relied on in terms of using technology, we really need to think about what these technologies look like when you hit the ground and in terms of the realities of adolescent girls. And that's about it. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sajid, for sharing this. There are multiple issues that are raised by Sajid and Paul's work. One urgent practical implication is the fact that children and adolescents will be returning to school well behind minimum standards for any particular grade. And for any given classroom, teachers will be faced with more disparate learning levels than ever before. So what to do? The good news is that there are interventions that have proven effective in improving learning outcomes, including for those who are not at grade level. A recent evidence synthesis we prepared, the Girls' Education Roadmap, outlines what has worked in some settings to improve learning outcomes, including structured pedagogy, ongoing teacher training, matching teaching to the learning level of students, providing remedial academic support, to name a few. You can check it out. To give us more insight into one of these promising approaches, it is my pleasure to invite Rukmini to talk about aligning teaching with the learning level of the child. Rukmini, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I'm just going to share my slides. Okay. Visible? Okay. So I guess my plug is going to be to say that we should seize the moment. There were things that we probably needed to do before but hadn't done. And the situation that we find ourselves in many parts of the world probably is providing the right time and the right opportunity to do some of these things. So let me see if I can make a case for what is to be done. The first thing I want to say is that, and I think there was a question in the chat box about how does the COVID year compare to past years. So in India, we have the data from the annual status of education report, the assert data, for many years. And what I've done is I've just pulled out data for a particular state in India, Karnataka, from 2010 till now. And the reason I pulled this state out is that we were able to get in just before the second wave and do an assert survey around February or March of 2021, which is still the 2020 school year. So as you can see, the yellow bars are the ability of children in third grade to read at second grade level. And you can see that across 2010 till 18, that number is actually very low. 20% of kids, you can say, are at grade level. And if you look at the green bars, which is grade 5 kids reading at least at grade 2 level is below 50%. So the COVID crisis and whatever it has brought for learning loss is happening layered onto a situation that was highly unsatisfactory to begin with. And you can see the difference between 2018 and 2020 in Karnataka, which follows pretty much what Sajida has been saying and Paul. There is a big drop, and you can see that the drop is, I would say, even greater for the younger kids than for the older kids. So this is where we are at. Now, I wanted to just take a little bit of time to explain. I mean, this is India. This is data from 2018. The red arrow shows you that Karnataka is pretty close to the all India average. And if you look at the percentage of kids who are in grade 3 at grade level, you can see there's a massive variation across the country. And what you don't see here is this is the percentage of kids who are at grade level, but there is also a very big difference in those who are just far behind. So in Himachal or in the top states, the next chunk of kids who are close to being at grade level is substantial. Whereas in the states who are lower down on this chart, you will find that the kids who are, the next chunk of kids I mean, the kids, there are very few kids who are at grade level and a large tail, which is well below. So this is where we were at. In case you don't know what the assert tool looks like, this is what it looks like. Can you read letters, words, a simple paragraph, and then the text that you see is a story at about second grade level. In math, these are the simple things. In reading, kids read in their own regional language. And in fact, the kids can choose what language to read at. So I wanted to just to explain teaching at the right level, I thought let me pull out the all India numbers from assert 2018. And India, like many other countries, organizes its schools by age and grade. So if you're 8 years old, you're likely to be in 3rd grade or 4th grade. If you're 10 years old, you're likely to be in 5th grade. But this is what the composition of a grade level looks like. So as you can see, whether you look at 3rd or 4th or 5th grade, there is a very wide distribution of learning levels within the same grade. This is the same at the aggregate level as is within a classroom. So first of all, in 3rd grade already 70% kids are not at grade level. So you've left a chunk of kids already behind. And if I look at 5th grade, 50% kids are at at 2nd grade level, maybe higher, but there is a big 50% even in 5th grade who are lower than at 2nd grade level, and this is pre-COVID. So this is the situation that teachers face in school. And if you are a country like India, then the 5th grade teacher uses the 5th grade textbook to go from the beginning of the textbook to the end. She teaches the curriculum, that is what she's required to do. And she's often really frustrated because she can't really help most of the kids who I always think of the back of the class, which is really not the back of the class, which is everything beyond the first 1 or 2 rows, who fall into these cells which are not colored. And slowly, I think they just, both mentally and physically leave the classroom because what is happening in the classroom is not for them. So when we do teaching at the right level, as we did before COVID hit, how do we actually do it? We do I think the simplest way perhaps to understand teaching at the right level is to say that while the school system has been organized in rows, using the same resources, same children, same teachers, same amount of time, what if you pivoted to, for some time during the school day, teaching by columns rather than by rows? So as you can see, across 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, substantial number of kids are yet at the beginner level where they cannot recognize letters. Similarly, there are substantial numbers of kids who can read letters but not words. And so rather than one teacher having to struggle with 5 different levels, could we have the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers actually handle some of the, so imagine that I've put the teachers on top of the columns. And yes, I don't have 5 teachers, but I can put one teacher to work with the kids who are not yet reading letters or just about reading letters. Another teacher to deal with the kids who are reading words, but not sentences. And a 3rd one who's dealing with kids who are, much closer to grade level. So essentially, that is what teaching at the right level does. It moves the school system from rows into columns. In India, we do it for part of the school day because nobody wants to be mixed up in this way for the whole day. And so a quick assessment using the assert-like assessment to figure out who's at which grade level. The assessment not only tells you the reading or the math level, but the teacher picks up, because it's done one-on-one, you pick up a lot about the kid, about where she's getting stuck, what kinds of activities will help her. Then we group children by their level, and each group has a teacher, simple activities. You use the assessment, to also regroup children. This process, when Pratham people do it, is 30 days to take a bulk of kids up to the higher level. When it's done within the school system, it takes, depending on how much time and how much effort is put in, it could take a little bit longer. I wanted to show you one of the biggest teaching at the right level interventions that we did with the government of UP, India's biggest state. Almost 3.5 million kids were involved in this. And this is what the improvement looked like in just about under 2 months. So even in a low baseline situation like UP, you could actually do this. And so I want to just end by saying that while teaching at the right level, we think is a very good answer to the problems that we see today. But I want to highlight that teaching at the right level works best, and there's a lot of RCT evidence to back its effectiveness, but it works best for kids who are at least 7 or 8 and above. Now, today, we have this very strange situation where kids who are in first and second grade are coming in literally off of their mother's laps into school. They've had no school, they've had no preschool, and they've also been at home in their mother's lap at a very difficult time when the family perhaps has not been able to also pay as much attention to the children. And this is data from Karnataka, which shows you the difference, even using the simple assert tool, for what the incoming cohorts looked like in 2018 and what they look like in 2020. So in 18, yeah, you had 40% kids who didn't know any letters, and in middle of first grade, that number is closer to 60% now. And clearly using first and second grade curriculum is not the right thing to do with these kids. We need perhaps a whole year of readiness activities and stuff that you do in preschool, in addition to helping them settle down in school. So a lot of socializing activities. So I want to stop by saying that I think we need a big plug for doing teaching at the right level types of things for helping to build back better, or to actually build better, as the case may be, for the grades 3 and above. And a huge shout out for treating first and second grade really like preschool, at least this year in most of the world, and involving children in very, very preschool-like activities. So this would be what would be my solutions for the situation that we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Thank you, Rukmini. That was fabulous. I was particularly struck by the challenges teachers are going to be facing or are facing with early grade learners. And thank you for highlighting that. I think there will be some interesting synergies between your point and some of what Michelle will be sharing next. So without further ado, I invite Michelle to walk us through what the implications are if we don't address these drops in learning, as well as the benefits that will accrue if we do take remediation seriously. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicole, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So as Nicole said, I'm going to speak here briefly on prioritizing learning when schools reopen and beyond, long-term implications of learning loss and recovery. And I think there will be a number of touch points along with the things that we've heard already today. My slides. There we go. Okay, so as we heard in the earlier presentations already, data is rapidly emerging, showing just devastating learning losses during school closures. These are confirming concerns, I think, as Nicole said earlier, we all kind of suspected, but I think as these data and findings are starting to roll in, it's confirming these concerns about the severity of the crisis for children and the need to really take action to help them recover. So what I'm going to touch on briefly today are 3 questions. The first is how much learning might be lost in the long term due to the school closures and these short-term learning losses that we're starting to have data on. The second is how could these losses be mitigated when children return to school? And then finally, how much of a difference could mitigation measures make for children's learning, including in the long run? So on the first, how much learning might be lost in the long term due to school closures? Why am I so worried about the long-term implications of this? Well, it's because we have evidence that short-term learning loss can continue to accumulate even after children return to school. So this is a study that looked at the Pakistan earthquake that happened back in 2005. Researchers went back 4 years later and found that 14 weeks of missed school for the children who had been affected had resulted in 2 years of lost learning for those children. And the most likely explanation they could come up with was that when the children re-entered school following those weeks of school closures, they were behind the level of instruction. They couldn't engage as meaningfully in the instruction as they would have otherwise, and they continued to fall further and further behind. So what we did was ask a similar question of the COVID school closures and said, what might the long-term consequences be of these current short-term learning losses that children are experiencing? And I was able to do this using an existing model of the learning process and simulate what could happen when the shock is introduced. And what I find is that looking first, say, as an example at today's 3rd graders, the simulation suggests that missing a third of a year of learning could reduce their long-term learning outcomes by the time they're in grade 10 by a full school year or more. Then I reran the model, assuming these 3rd graders missed half a year's worth of learning, which I think, as the data that comes rolling in seems the much more likely scenario, if not even larger learning losses. And so, simulating out half a year's worth of learning loss suggests they could lose as much of a year and a half's worth of learning by the time they reach grade 10. What's driving these long-term accumulations? It's the same thing that we saw in Pakistan. Because children are re-entering school behind the curriculum, they continue to fall further and further behind without remediation efforts to help them catch up. Furthermore, I also find that the youngest children stand to lose the most. And so now running the same model, but for 1st graders, I find that if they miss half a year's worth of learning, that could accumulate to as much as 2.2 years of learning loss by the time they are in grade 10. And again, how can that be? How are we seeing these really large accumulating losses? Well, it's because, and we heard a bit of this from Rukmini and others, these children are missing out on core building blocks that they need for later learning. So if you have a 1st grader who, for example, has missed out on double-digit addition while they were out of school, if they re-enter, the curriculum picks up right where they're expected to be and starts teaching them, say, simple multiplication. They don't have the building blocks necessary to engage in that instruction. And so they're in school, but they're continuing to not learn because they can't keep up with what they're being taught. So on that note, how could these losses be mitigated when children return to school? At RISE, we've been working on a set of principles that can both address learning losses when children return to school and that also represent similar good practices for what is needed to address the underlying learning crisis that predated the COVID school closures. We summarize these as what we call the ALIGNS principles, which stands for aligning levels of instruction with goals and the needs of students. And they represent 4 principles. So the first is to set clear learning goals, particularly in the COVID context for catch up on foundational skills. The second is to adapt instruction to children's learning levels, including assessing learning when they return. The third is to support teachers and other instructors. These are new practices that we're wanting them to implement. They're going to need a lot of support to do this. And then finally, to adapt particular approaches to the opportunities and constraints of the context. There isn't going to be a silver bullet solution. Any approaches are going to need to be adapted to the local context. So I'm just going to touch briefly on a couple of these. So first, set learning goals with a focus on foundational skills. Why the focus on foundational skills? Because we have a lot of evidence that children who miss out on foundational skills early in their schooling rarely catch up on those. So again, by missing foundational skills, they're often unable to gain later competencies and their learning trajectories flatten even if they stay in school. So I'm concerned that young children missing foundational skills may have the largest negative long-term consequences for learning coming out of the COVID education crisis. On the second principle, adapting instruction to children's learning levels. So children are going to be behind when they return to school, but by unknown and varying amounts. And teachers are going to need a sense of the learning levels in their classroom in order to know how to adapt their instruction. So they're going to need a way to assess children's learning. This could be something like a simple assert assessment, which is what's pictured here. It could also look like repurposing an existing assessment that's already in the education system. So for example, we're giving third graders the second grade evaluative, sorry for the background noise, street noise, giving third graders the second grade assessment to see what they learned and what they've missed out on that needs to be recovered. From those assessment results, we're going to need teachers to adapt their instruction. This also could take different forms, so they could streamline or condense the curriculum, deprioritizing some of the less necessary content to allow the time to catch up and prioritize the most necessary content. They could begin the year teaching from the previous year's curriculum, or use some of the approaches that have been mentioned here, such as teaching at the right level or a structured pedagogy type approach that's adapted for catch up and ongoing learning. All of these options are going to require supporting, equipping, and enabling teachers to repurpose assessment tools and adapt their instruction. This is a lot to ask of teachers. These are non-trivial undertakings. And so it can't all just be put on their shoulders. They're going to need the support of the education system to help them implement these new practices. And then finally, I'm not going to cover everything that's on here, but just to say, we have evidence that similar practices can address the underlying learning crisis, allowing education systems to come back stronger in the long run. And so these are just 4 examples of reforms that predated COVID, but where these alliance principles were put into action with significant and positive impacts on foundational learning. So these are good practices, both in the context of catch up when children return, and also if we're going to go to the trouble of training teachers and supporting teachers and adapting classroom practices to help children catch up, then some of these practices should be carried forward in a way that's going to help this education system come back stronger and address the low learning that was already prevalent in so many places before COVID. So from that, how much of a difference could mitigation measures make for children's learning? I now circle back to the same model that I showed at the beginning and simulate the long-term implications of possible catch-up programs. And so now looking again at today's 3rd grade students, let's assume half a year's learning loss initially. With no mitigation, it suggests they might lose about a year and a half by the time they're in grade 10. That's what we saw earlier. What I find when I simulate catch-up programs is that remediation programs when children return to school could reduce that long-term learning loss, perhaps to about a year's worth of learning loss. It can compensate for some of those losses and help children catch up. But then keeping these good practices in place long-term, such as ensuring children can keep up with the level of instruction, that curriculum is paced more appropriately for their learning levels, that children aren't allowed to fall so far behind, that they stay on a positive learning trajectory. Some of these practices could actually help systems come back stronger than before and result in positive outcomes. So I think there's an opening and some political openness that wasn't here before COVID, and an opportunity that is certainly not guaranteed, but is possible to address some of these the underlying learning crisis that was there before COVID, while also addressing the current crisis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle, for that great presentation and wrap up. And thank you to all our panelists for their inspiring presentations. At this stage, we'll move to discussion and Q&A. As a reminder, you can share your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom. Before we get started, we're all on screen. Excellent. So our first question, the audience can please feel free to continue to submit questions to the chat, is for Rukmini. And an audience member says that it's, congratulates you on the approach, teaching at the right level, basing it on competency, and wonders about doing this at scale. How is it possible to monitor and support teachers when you're working in so many schools? Like how does the program work at scale?
So yes, I think it can work at scale. The way we have used it in India is we first create, let's say if I take the example that I gave in my presentation of Uttar Pradesh, which is India's biggest state, 130,000 government primary schools. What was done there is that it had to take a stage-wise approach. So first there was a team of about 300 or 400 people who underwent a short orientation, but then actually carried out a teaching at the right level class in their own school for at least 2 to 3 weeks. And of course, that needs to be adjusted depending on the time frame at which we are operating. Once they were able to actually see significant change in their own children's learning levels by following some of the basic principles that I laid out, they then trained the next level of trainers who could then work with the teachers. But I think the key here was that they were leaders of practice. They were not just trainers who got a manual and did it. And it's the same trainers who actually provided the on-ground support to teachers. We've seen that when you do that, you're actually able to move a very large system because you're being led and you're being trained by people who have done it themselves. And so I would say that the only thing to think about right now is that time is short. You need to have all of this roll out quite quickly. But I think that even a certain amount of practice by the leaders really helps to boost confidence, to build self-reliance. You're not dependent on people coming from somewhere else and giving you this input. And I know, Nicole, you wanted us to focus largely on what will happen in schools, but I just wanted to mention that in anticipation of schools opening, we've just carried out a big community-based learning campaign, which has also showed promising results. So while I think a lot of support and so on is needed for instructors, I do think that, I think you have to take what you have right now and kind of move with it, and then build on it as it gets, into place.
Thanks, Rukmini. Building off of that last question, I'll ask, and if other panelists wanted to comment on that, let me know. But your comment about working in the community, another participant asks whether whether the role of the family, especially older sisters, working with younger siblings, they hear a lot from their partners that adolescent girls are impacted themselves. They're also responsible for overseeing their younger siblings and making sure that they're going to school or learning. And sort of tapping into that, I don't know if the community-based work did this, but tapping into that sort of interfamilial mentoring that goes on. Is it a win-win or is it a lose-lose? As our participant asked. What do you think?
I think Sajida is going to say something.
I think we can potentially do it, but it would be a little bit of effort. And what we don't have is the education level of the sibling, because we have only, and I think that would be a limitation. One of the things we find in the rapid surveys is parental education had a lot to do with how much they were learning and continuing schooling. And of course, this is a context where tutoring, after school private tutoring is a really important part of school success. 80% of these adolescent respondents say that they get some form of private tutoring outside of school. And that ends up being, again, linked to my main point, which is the most marginalized girls do worse because they don't have these kinds of supports, in addition to having competing demands on their time from housework, etc.
Nicole, if I can just add one small bit. In our community campaign that we ran, which was over 12,000 villages, so very large, about 25-30,000 volunteers. Many were of high school age. They were working with small groups very close to their own, own homes. And obviously it was a very large campaign. We are verifying some of the results by going back, but I think a promising jump up. And I think even more than that, the reason I would say it was a win-win is it creates an environment of support that these children are going to continue to need. Teachers will do some, but families and communities need to be part of that journey. And so therefore, I think that the community stuff is also really important.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pivot a little bit because to get everybody's questions in. Both Paul and Sajida, you alluded to the fact that the governments had been using radio and television and even internet to reach students during COVID. And I think, Paul, you had some data specifically showing that, that very few were reached by those programs. So I guess any lessons in terms of what do we do with that? I mean, how are we, what are we going to do, in the future? Because this will happen again, whether it's climate disaster, another pandemic, Anyway, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And I think the analysis using the cell phone towers and radio coverage is quite new, but we've just managed to get hold of a lot of the locations and reach. And it seems like a lot of the areas are outside the reach of. So I think even that very simple fact should make people pause and think, well, if a modality is distance learning, but we know they can't be reached, well, we need to reflect on how it changes. But I think access to these kind of technologies is multifaceted as well. So even if you're within the reach of a radio tower, you might not have a radio. And even if you have a radio, we know that there's gendered impacts in access to radio as well. So we know that often, there's a queue for who gets access to cell phones and stuff. So we need to be careful about assuming that everybody has these access, but there are some simple checks you can do. I think one of the key things for me is not just using radio's pedagogy, but how you use it in terms of it's very one way, so it's quite lecturing style. So it's chalk and talk, if you will, which is the exact pedagogy we're trying to move away from in terms of the classroom experience. So I do think there is a time for the education community to support governments to kind of pause and say, well, if schools close again, how are we going to respond? And how do we basically make sure that we don't exclude the most marginalized? Because the areas with poor cell phone coverage are the poorest areas. We know this as well. So I don't know the answer, but I think this is a question that should be on the table of local education groups and government discussions just for when the next round of school closures come for whatever reasons. It could be pandemic or earthquakes or climate change. But yeah, planning ahead properly, I think, is a useful lesson for us all.
Thanks, Paul. Sajid, did you want to briefly add?
Just a little bit to say that one of the things that really surprised me in the qualitative data is that girls identified passive learning as one of the major problems, some of the virtual engagement that they were talking about. And we found that even a very limited kind of more interactive opportunity, like in the WhatsApp groups, was very welcome. So it's a bit surprising because schools in Bangladesh, you don't see children calling out or participating in any way, but the fact that they themselves identified the interactive aspect of learning as being important suggests sort of some beyond cognitive types of processes that are going on, perhaps through social interactions, perhaps in other ways that is important to preserve and is missing in most virtual outreach.
Yeah, we found exactly the same, Saida. I think there's a lot to be said for the school as a kind of a place for girls to go, not just for learning, but for community, for peers, meet their friends. I think the lockdown was quite lonely, and that speaks to some of the mental health kind of challenges that were raised as well by some of the girls. So I think there's a lot to be said for interactive pedagogies and just having people to talk to during pandemics. I think we can all we can all appreciate the value of that.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, one last question for Michelle. as you're hearing some of these data come in from the studies, do you think your model is conservative? Are your models conservative, or are they going to, would you project, like, using some of this field-based data? What do you think? How will that pan out?
It's a great question. I worry my model is very conservative in terms of underestimating possible learning losses. Both as data starts rolling in, like, I mean, we're just seeing tremendous losses while schools have been out. It's not just that children are learning less than they would have otherwise, but they're actually falling backwards. I mean, we saw that in Paul's presentation, and there's at least a handful of other data sources that show similar evidence at this point. So we know children didn't learn as much as expected, but we're also seeing evidence of actual forgetting, which means they've missed out on more than a year's worth of learning loss. And I've run simulations for larger amounts. I think my model starts to break down at more than a year's worth of learning loss. It doesn't know how to take that into account. And to be honest, I kind of stopped presenting the higher ones because I think it gets to the point of doomsaying, and it becomes really hard to think about how to address it, right? Like when it's so bad. So I do think, I mean, I just don't think we can overemphasize the extent to which it really is a crisis for these children. They really are going to need a lot of support, and not just them, but the school systems and the education systems that they find themselves in. I really don't think we can underline too much just the need for some of these approaches to help them catch up. And maybe I'll just comment. I saw a question in the Q&A that was asking about, it was a trade-off question. If you have limited resources, where should you invest? Should it be the younger kids? Should it be the older kids who are maybe entering the workforce? And I think trade-off questions are always really hard, right? Because no one wants to make the trade-offs. So there's never a good or easy answer to those questions. But I will say, with what we're looking at, I think it has to be the primary school children, because we also are starting to have evidence that the older children were at least more able to engage in some instruction. While schools were closed, they are more likely to be literate than a second grader, so they could at least read some materials that they had. They're more able to stay engaged and more able to kind of make things happen on their own. I think these primary school-aged children who've missed out on those foundational building blocks, we're looking at them being on a lower trajectory for the remaining years of their schooling, and to get them on a steeper trajectory that's going to be able to sustain them through the rest of their years of schooling, I think is really where our focus needs to be.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. We're close to time here, so I do want to give everybody do a lightning round of 30 seconds, last words, last takeaways for everybody. But the learning loss that was projected is unfortunately becoming visible, and it is significant. And when we intersect it with poverty and gender, we have to pay special attention to what it is telling us beneath the surface. So I'll just follow the order of presentation. Paul, do you want to give us 30 seconds final word?
I think you summed it up really well. I think the only thing for me is we were caught unawares last year. I think that the probability of this happening again, sadly, is quite high, and we should be better prepared next time. And I think we've got the evidence to allow us to be.
Thank you. Sajida.
Yeah, so I would say this was a terrible shock to the school system, to the economy, but shocks are going to be increasingly common, I agree. And they have very different effects on different people. We need to understand these differences within communities look fairly homogeneous. And pay attention to them.
Thank you. Rukmini.
So I would really urge everybody to seize the moment. There were things we should have done before, we didn't. We've got to do them now. On the trade-off question, I think that's a tough one. Everybody's facing it. I would agree with Michelle. I would go with catch up for the kids who are third grade and older. But we are depending, for example, a lot of our strategy on really building mothers' capability to help the first and second graders, because they're going to need it. Moms can help at that stage, bring them into the center of the stage and let them stand side by side, I mean, figuratively, with the teachers. So help the youngest ones get ready and help the older ones catch up.
Thank you. Michelle.
Yeah, absolutely. I would end on maybe a higher note than my last comment was, because I think we're starting to come to terms with the severity, but also I do think there's an opportunity here, right? There is more attention on low learning than there was pre-COVID. There's more recognition of what needs to be done than pre-COVID. And so I would also, maybe in line with Rukmini's, but kind of a seize the opportunity. Let's push for change. Let's push for reform that maybe would have taken 20 years pre-COVID, and maybe we could get them done in 2 years post-COVID. You know, there's a political openness and an attention opportunity to take action.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Once again, thank you to all our panelists and all of you for joining the webinar today. We invite you to explore who is doing what in the gender and education space, where the greatest needs are and the latest evidence at www.egerresource.org. We have over 300 organizations and funders and more than 600 programs, studies, and campaigns mapped, coded, and searchable. And we hope you will join us by sharing your work through EGER. It's a great place to identify partners, donors, ideas, and grantees. So we also invite you to subscribe to the EGER Quarterly Digest to stay informed of the latest from EGER. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you have a lovely day or evening. And thanks again, and goodbye.